A Seattle judge is the second to indefinitely block Trump's birthright citizenship order. A judge also has issued an emergency order halting DOGE and their access to Treasury payment systems. This comes out of a U.S. District Court in New York. I also have a subsequent sort of addition to that story. A federal judge on Friday decided not to immediately block the Department of Government Efficiency's DOGE access to the U.S. Labor Department systems. I'm not sure which order that these came in. It's Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130 and 103.5 FM. Streaming on the iHeart Radio app. Be sure to update the app if you haven't done so and take advantage of the presets and set it on Twin Cities News Talk as I broadcast from the 651 Carpet, home of the Next Day Install Studios, to hopefully provide some clarity on this because I've had a lot of listeners reaching out. Lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien. First off, were you entertained by the Super Bowl last night?
The game itself, yeah. Even though I was kind of loosely cheering for the Chiefs because my firm's headquartered there and I don't like Eagles fans, you got to appreciate the caliber of a defensive beatdown that was. I mean, I've not seen anything like that in a long time. I mean, the only disappointment I had is I think the Eagles defense should have been given co-MVPs instead of giving it to Jalen Hurts because they were lights out. They were good.
Well, I know you're a big Kendrick Lamar fan as well, so you had to enjoy the halftime show too, so.
I sort of tuned out. I think the dog needed to go outside at that point, so I had to go deal with that. So it was a good time to take a break.
So, first off, what do you know exactly what's happened now with the judge that was halting the DOGE access? Because I have two stories here. One says it was halted, and then another one says they decided not to go and block it. Do you know where it is currently?
Well, there's an action. There was the order that everybody's talking about was an ex parte order that was filed by all the Democrat attorneys general in U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. All these, you're talking about, states, U.S. district, the federal district courts have different districts across the country. Minnesota has one. Some states have multiple. So that's where these actions are brought. And this one was one. This one, it's a temporary restraining order until the permanent judge hears it. So this Paul Engelmayer, who's the judge that heard this motion and issued the order, he was the emergency judge on duty. Whether it be federal court or state court, there's always a judge on duty for emergency motions. I don't know that this necessarily constitutes an emergency, but and then there's a lot of discussion about that. But regardless, he heard it, and then it gets referred on to the permanent judge for the case. So this is the last time that Engelmayer will likely touch this case. But that's kind of the procedural posture of this. It was an ex parte emergency motion brought by these attorneys general, and I've looked at the order, and there's not much there to it. It just says, "Oh, we think that they're going to prevail, so we're going to grant this injunction." And that's all it says. There's no other reasoning about it. I have seen the story about the Labor Department. This order dealt with, if you recall, John. There was an order that said that there was a complaint about the DOGE employees having access to the payment systems or the financial systems of the Treasury Department, and a judge ruled that was a no-go. So Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, essentially hired a couple of DOGE employees so that they would have clearance to do it. And that's where this one came from, because if you use the language about providing access, how these employees had to be hired and with background checks and security clearances and all that, and then no handing off access to political appointees and such. It's essentially in response to Bessent's actions of hiring some of the DOGE employees inside of the Treasury to get around the first court order.
Talking with a lawyer extraordinaire, Jeff O'Brien, I've had a lot of people reaching out and just wanting to know the basics as to how is it that these judges at the state level are able to issue these rulings or these blocks to Trump's executive orders. I think the disconnect is, why isn't this coming from D.C.? Why is this coming from individual states and what they seem to look at as sort of just random judges across the country? So how is it they have the power to go and thwart what Trump is doing, from, the executive branch?
Sure. Just to be clear, these aren't state court judges. These are federal judges sitting in districts in states. Like I said, there's federal district courts in every state because there's issues involving federal law, and so that's why we have federal courts. If here in Minneapolis, we have the government center, which here's where you have your state court action, and 2 blocks away is the federal courthouse. So there's matters that federal courts have to hear, and that's why that's where these cases are being carried out. Now, in terms of why it ended up in the Southern District of New York, this appears to be forum shopping. They somehow, and there's some chatter online that these attorneys general may have had whoever was in charge of filing the case had inside intel that this particular judge, they were going to have a favorable judge on emergency duty in the Southern District of New York versus bringing this someplace else. Like and I brought actions over the years against state government, most notably against Governor Walz to roll back the restrictions on the bars and restaurants during COVID. And the rule here is if you're going to sue a state agency or the governor or a state official, you do it in Ramsey County because that's in St. Paul where the seat of government is. So there's nothing that requires that these lawsuits be brought in the DC circuit, the federal DC circuit. But so we'll see where this ends up. So that's why the judge in Washington on the birthright citizenship executive order, which I would say I think the president and his legal advisors knew all along they were going to get a court challenge. The point of that executive order was to get the Supreme Court to rule on what subject to the lawful jurisdiction of the U.S. means. And so that wasn't a surprise. But these cases can be brought in any whatever federal jurisdiction. But this one kind of reeks of forum shopping. They knew they were going to get a favorable judge to at least slow this down. Now the permanent judge may end up dissolving this and let things proceed, or reform the order so it's not as broad. But this is all it really is. It seems to me just another stall tactic on the other side.
Is there, and again, talking with lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien, is there a rule of thumb that you apply or that a listener could apply when they see these attempts to block Trump's agenda from these district, court judges in various parts of the country? And there's a level of frustration that people have. Trump goes and implements something, and then what they consider to be is some, random federal judge moves to block it. Is there, is there sort of a general rule of thumb that you take in sort of gauging the seriousness of these particular, efforts by these judges?
Well, I always look at who appointed the judge because you can go back and take a look and see which president, because these federal judges are all appointed or nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So the Washington judge, I think, was a Reagan appointee, and so that's one thing. I think if I recall right, this judge in New York was a Democrat appointee. So I think, you read some people who try to break these cases down, though, it's saying, this is a such and such appointee. So I think there's, you can kind of hint that there might be some bias that if the judge got appointed by a president from the opposing party, that they may not necessarily approve of what's transpiring right now.
What is the likelihood that that these end up all the way at the Supreme Court? I mean, I guess it really just comes down to how strong a case that the initial judge that blocked it put forward, correct? And depending on where it goes from there, before we see whether or not this is kicked up all the way, on a number of these issues to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, birthright citizenship is absolutely going to get appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. They're going to have to say, and that was, my opinion, that was the point of the executive order, was to get the Supreme Court to rule on the scope of that clause in, the 14th 14th Amendment and find out how far it goes. It may depend. I mean, look, we know that there's strongly held views on both sides. Whoever is losing is going to keep appealing it. So my guess is the Supreme Court is going to ultimately end up having to weigh in on the issue of DOGE being. And when I say DOGE, this is President Trump basically renamed this Digital Information Service Department that President Obama had created inside the executive branch. He renamed it as DOGE, and that's so this is a special agency of the executive branch that's doing this. It isn't like everybody keeps talking about Elon Musk having access. That's really not. That's just kind of misleading. It's a special agency of the executive branch that's conducting essentially an audit of the executive branch agencies. But I think it's sensible to point is, it could end up in front of the Supreme Court. Sure. I also think there's some chatter about this impeachment proceedings against this Judge Engelmayer, and it is possible to impeach a federal judge. So that's the other wrinkle here is, will Congress initiate impeachment proceedings simply as maybe kind of a brushback pitch to these federal judges that want to maybe overstep their bounds.
I got a post. A friend of the show, Rosemount Rick, wants me to ask if you can explain what ex parte means.
Yeah, ex parte means the other side doesn't have notice. Ex parte means when you're talking about these emergency motions, is the one side is going in front of the judge and filing all of this paperwork and not having to provide it to the other side ahead of the hearing and not having the other side present at the hearing. So this is an emergency motion. You go in front of the emergency judge, and now it's going to be kicked to this permanent judge who will actually hear both sides of it. That's what when they talk about setting an order to show cause hearing, these emergency orders don't stay in place very long. They have an ex parte motion, judge grants the order, and then sets it on for a order to show cause hearing. So then the other side is then given notice and given an opportunity to show up and argue why this order shouldn't stay in place. So again, kind of sneaky what they did. These emergency motions, they're rarely granted. So I think that's what some folks, even including myself, are questioning here is there's no explanation as to what the emergency was as to why this in the order. There's no opinion that goes along with it. And so this seems to be very partisan on the judge's part, and that's why there's some chatter about the validity of this.
But Jeff O'Brien, everything Trump does is an emergency. So you frame it that way, and it's Trump's involved. It's an emergency.
Yeah, they could just put an opinion out because Trump, and then we're finding for whoever. So yeah,
let's get to a couple of talkbacks that have rolled in as we talk with lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien.
Making these decisions that people can't be fired, apparently that's pretty much admitting that these people are unaccountable to nobody, which is what people are complaining about with Elon Musk. And last I checked, none of these bureaucrats were elected either, and they're accountable to nobody. Nobody knows their name. They impose levies and impose fines and make rules just like Congress is supposed to only do, but they're doing it too. So I have no idea what they're complaining about.
When it comes to DOGE, and I made this comment earlier in the show, I think everybody, regardless of political party, was, under the impression that Biden wasn't the one calling the shots for his administration. We just simply didn't know who was doing it. And in this case, when it comes to what Elon Musk is doing, they're doing it in the light of day. They're not hiding any of it. And so I think that's frustrating to, those on the left, because so much of what they've been doing in wasting money has been exposed. I know they don't like Elon and they want to go and target him because they want him to be on their side, be that as it may. At least he's being transparent about the process.
Yeah, and there's a lot of chatter about separation of powers and all this, but this is basically the executive branch conducting an audit of other executive branch agencies. So, and I think on the side that's screaming about this, be careful because everybody. You're getting them right now, John. I'm getting everybody's getting their tax documents for the year.
Yeah.
And seeing how much they have to pay.
It's gross.
And watching what's going on out there, and people are getting upset.
Yeah. Let's go to another. I got a question for you here, Jeff O'Brien.
Good morning, gentlemen. In case you don't cover this, regarding the financial executive orders, I've always been under the impression that, yes, the legislative branch allocates the funds, but the executive branch decides where they're spent and how they're spent. So I'm not sure how a judge can block those orders. So if we can answer that, that would be great.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to what you were just talking about, Jeff O'Brien.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's what you're talking about. People talk about separation of powers and checks and balances. This is, to me, an inappropriate role of the judiciary to opine as to how the executive branch determines if those dollars were spent in an appropriate manner. Absolutely.
Let's go to another question for you.
So if I'm not mistaken, I thought that the federal judges were under the purview of the president, and the president can fire them at will or whenever he wanted to. I thought Clinton did that when he came in office. He fired all the federal judges. Clarity on that.
Any thoughts on that, Jeff O'Brien?
Yeah, I think the caller is confusing judges versus U.S. attorneys. There's, in every federal, every state, there's a U.S. attorney for, whatever federal district that we have. So, like I said, Minnesota has one district, Iowa has two, South Dakota has one. I know because I'm admitted to practice in all of those jurisdictions, in those federal districts. So we have to get, as lawyers, we have to get separately admitted to be practicing in front of the federal courts. But there's a U.S. attorney; those serve at the will of the president. Federal judges, district court judges, just like Court of Appeals judges, just like Supreme Court judges, have lifetime appointments. So when you see confirmation hearings going on in Washington, regardless of who the president is, for judges, those are lifetime appointments. So federal district court judges get appointed just like a Supreme Court justice or a Court of Appeals judge. They are lifetime appointees. The president cannot fire federal judges at will. U.S. attorneys, they can, not judges.
Lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien, thank you so much for your time and your insight this morning. It was great to talk to you. And anywhere you'd like the listeners to go and check out regarding what you do full time.
Well, you can always check me out on my firm website is hushblackwell.com, HUSCH Blackwell.com. You can find my personal site, jeffreyobrien.today. You can find me on X at Jeff O'Brien, LinkedIn, Facebook. Google my name, and you'll probably find some link into my world.
I wonder if there's going to be a lawsuit to keep Trump from stopping the minting of new pennies. I'm waiting for that one to drop.
Yeah, don't give him any ideas, John.
Great talking with Jeff. Thanks for coming on this morning, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John.